From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about Pakistan's foreign policy challenges. We'll be touching on a range of issues, from Afghanistan and the implications of the U.S. military withdrawal, to relations with India, China, and Saudi Arabia, as well as bilateral ties with the U.S. under the Biden administration. There's a lot of ground to cover, but thankfully we've got three great guests joining us on the program today to help us make sense of things. Marvin Weinbaum, Madiha Afzal, and Syed Mohammad Ali. Marvin is the head of MEI's Afghanistan and Pakistan program. Madiha is the David M. Rubenstein Fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Her research lies at the intersection of political economy, development, and security with a focus on Pakistan. Mohammad Ali has extensive experience working with multilateral, bilateral, government, and non-government organizations on varied international development challenges. He's a non-resident scholar with MEI's Afghanistan and Pakistan program and a weekly columnist for Pakistan's Express Tribune. Marvin, Madiha, Mohammad Ali, welcome to the program, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Mohammad Ali, let's start with what is one of the most pressing issues right now, the U.S. military withdrawal from Afghanistan and its regional ramifications. The withdrawal is meant to be wrapping up fairly soon, the next few weeks. How is the U.S. decision being viewed in Pakistan, and how is Islamabad preparing for what might come next?
Well, Alistair, despite sort of the talk of a responsible exit, the manner in which the withdrawal is taking place with a very set timeline is creating stress within Pakistan as well. I mean, there is a fear that the threat of violence is imminent and that could have consequences like a refugee flow and increased restiveness on the Pakistani side of the Durand line. Now, the Taliban do seem adamant on pursuing a military strategy to maximize their gains vis-a-vis other domestic actors. And while Pakistan has, of course, exercised leverage on the Taliban, it seems that leverage might be overestimated. I mean, I kind of like this phrasing by a former Pakistani ambassador, Tawqir Hussain, writing for The Dawn, a local Pakistani paper, who talks about an overly powerful Taliban. He sort of dubs them as potentially having reverse leverage in Pakistan and in Pakistan's tribal areas. There are different ways of viewing the same situation. Now, the Congressional Research Service recently in its report notes that Islamabad may in fact favor a weak and destabilized Afghanistan rather than a strong unified Afghan state, especially a state led by the Pashtuns, because it would fear Pashtun restiveness, within Pakistan. It notes Pakistan's fear of encirclement by India. At the same time, it takes a somewhat naive view of India's involvement in Afghanistan. It rightly praises India's role as a major regional contributor to Afghan reconstruction. It's somewhat disappointed that Indian overtures are being sort of made towards the Taliban given the ground realities, and it notes the reluctance that India has in terms of providing strategic support to the Kabul government, but it largely ignores New Delhi's more sort of insidious role in Afghanistan, supporting restiveness in Balochistan across the border in Pakistan, the targeting of Chinese investments, and that obliviousness is the kind of perfect material for fueling proxy conflicts in the region that the US cannot afford to ignore or be oblivious to. One other small point, in terms of concern within Pakistan, there is some discomfort at the conflation of Pakistan's reluctance to provide US military bases and its sort of inclusion on the FATF grey list, which is this, grey list for terror financing. Now, Pakistan, in the view of many analysts, and perhaps even in my own view, there's a difference between Pakistan's reluctance to allow counter-terrorism operations long-term, given all the controversy around drone strikes and the collateral damage they've caused and potentially what could happen with counter-terrorism operations long-term in Afghanistan, and Pakistan's sort of, use of Islamic militants. And, especially the Taliban have, issued quite naked threats to states that will provide bases to the US for long-term counterterrorism. So there's some of that concern also, right? Was how Pakistan was kind of arm twisted in the past and it will still be arm twisted. And in the same breath, talking about FATF causes, in the minds of analysts, causes discomfort.
Madiha, building on what Muhammad Ali just said, what challenges and opportunities does the U.S. withdrawal create for Pakistan as you see it?
Sure. I think I'll talk a little bit about it from both the relationship with the US, Pakistan's relationship with the US perspective, and then, sort of the relationship with Afghanistan and sort of the regional ramifications. So from the perspective of Pakistan's relationship with the US, I think the last couple of years as Pakistan has helped with the Afghan peace process and negotiations have been in some ways a good phase for Pakistan, right? It reset its relationship with the United States. It's been needed, important for the US. And so in some ways, this was the easy part. Now comes a new phase of its relationship with the US as the US withdraws completely from Afghanistan that brings both, I think, challenges and opportunities. I think the opportunity is for Pakistan to build a relationship with the US that is based on something other than Afghanistan and not focused on Afghanistan alone. The challenge, of course, is that Pakistan is still being boxed in many ways by Afghanistan when it comes to how the US looks at it. So currently there's a lot of engagement going on in terms of figuring out some sort of counter-terror, over the horizon counter-terror arrangement that the US wants to figure out as it withdraws. And this kind of engagement, of course, carries with it significant risks and opportunities. And again, the challenge of being thought of primarily in the Afghanistan prism, which brings with it a whole host of issues like blame on Pakistan for things going wrong in Afghanistan and so on. So I think that is sort of a top level kind of view of how the relationship with the US will evolve. When it comes to looking at things a little bit more regionally, I think, there are going to be repercussions of the withdrawal of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan on Pakistan. And given sort of the prognosis of how things are going to go in Afghanistan, I've written about this over the past few months. I mean, I think the most likely outcome is some sort of protracted civil war in Afghanistan, increasing instability, and then perhaps an eventual ascendance of the Taliban. All of this, at least in the initial protracted violence phase, is going to have negative repercussions on Pakistan in terms of sort of the bleeding over of the instability from Afghanistan to Pakistan. And one of the ways this will manifest is refugee flows to Pakistan as well as to other countries. And I think, again, Afghans are very wary of Pakistan at this point in time. And, any instability in Afghanistan and the rise of the Taliban is eventually thought of in Afghanistan as something that Pakistan holds some blame for, whether Pakistan thinks that's fair or not. Of course, and this is sort of my last point here, I think, of course, there are, for Pakistan, going to be opportunities for control that will emerge in Afghanistan post-US withdrawal. But again, the challenge is that Pakistan will have competitors for this control. It's perhaps in the strongest position given its relationship with the Taliban. But as Muhammad Ali noted, that relationship is not what people think it may be. And so those opportunities for control are going to be contested by other regional players, including India and, sort of the wider region, China, Russia, Turkey, and so on. It's going to be a new challenging phase for Pakistan.
Marvin, as the U.S. withdraws its forces from Afghanistan, Washington is scrambling to come up with alternative basing arrangements in the region for carrying out critical military and intelligence missions. In recent weeks, both CIA Director Bill Burns and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin have visited Islamabad to hold talks with Pakistani officials. But there's a widespread political and popular opposition in Pakistan to the idea of allowing the U.S. to use its territory to launch operations. How long are the odds that a deal can be reached in your view, and what, if anything, would it take to make it happen?
The odds are very long. The Pakistani leadership, foreign minister particularly, have been pretty categorical in their stating that it's not going to take place. The United States is not going to be giving any kind of basing arrangements. The Prime Minister has a long history of objecting to involvement with the United States on the war against terrorism in Afghanistan. So we know where his inclinations are. And then, as you point out, the popular opposition really can't be overestimated. And it grows out of the history of this kind of relationship, where not only were drones used from Pakistan soil, drones used against targets within Pakistan, often with the collaboration of the security forces, I might mention, but it was being done secretly. And as the U.S. looks at it, it doesn't necessarily take these expressions that we don't want any part of it. It doesn't take it necessarily at face value, because we do have this history of Pakistan saying one thing and doing another. But I believe in this case, there's very little likelihood that, given what has been discussed in a public level now, is going to make it possible for Pakistan, whether it's publicly or surreptitiously, to now agree to any kind of deal which the United States is going to be able to realize what it needs basically in Afghanistan, and that is the ability to launch close air support from close proximity.
Muhammad Ali, Pakistan was not invited to President Biden's Earth Day climate summit, a decision that disappointed many in the country. Do you think that episode was emblematic of a broader issue in the bilateral relationship, its limited focus?
It seems to be. I mean, it was the first interaction that Pakistan could have had with the US at the highest level. And the US not inviting, the Pakistani prime minister, but inviting those from India, Bangladesh, Bhutan was considered a deliberate snub, as was the exclusion of Pakistan from the itinerary of John Kerry, the climate advisor to President Biden, in the lead up to that summit. Now, the Pakistani Prime Minister's advisor on climate was invited to a sub-panel on resilience, but, the Prime Minister was not given a platform. And this is despite the fact that Pakistan is a climate change hotspot. It has caused insignificant damage in terms of emissions, not due to conscious effort, perhaps, but the size of the economy. Nonetheless, Pakistan has recently embarked on several ambitious projects, such as the 10 billion tree tsunami and other environmental and conservation efforts, which have gotten it some international praise. In fact, Pakistan has just co-hosted with the United Nations Environmental Program the World Environment Day. Now, besides the optics of sort of Pakistan being perhaps deliberately snubbed, there are coincidentally climate change poses major concerns, security concerns for South Asia. Water scarcity remains a major source of contention and a potential threat multiplier, what the Department of Defense has called a threat multiplier, between upper riparian India and Pakistan when it comes to sharing waterways of the Indus. Water sharing can, in fact, also become a major source of tension between Pakistan and the incoming government in Afghanistan, given that these two countries do not have a formal water sharing treaty for the Kabul River. Afghanistan, in fact, has no water sharing treaty with any of its neighboring countries. It had one with Iran from the 1970s, which was never really operationalized. So, these are real environmental issues with the glacial melt in the Hindu Kush and the Himalayan ranges. I mean, these are going to be major sources of tension in the long run. And, there needed to have been a regional approach. And the Biden summit was such an opportunity, right, to have encouraged more sort of regional cooperation that was missed, besides the optics of telling Pakistan that, largely its value is in terms of what it can do in terms of stabilizing Afghanistan.
Madiha, following up on that, do you think the U.S. would benefit from having a more proactive, broader-based relationship with Pakistan that extends beyond just the kind of Afghanistan prism?
Yes, I absolutely think so. And I think, there are certainly skeptics on the US end about that. I think on both sides, right, on the Pakistani end as well as the US end, there is a huge amount of mistrust that has built up over not just years, but decades. And it mostly stems, honestly, from Afghanistan. I think perhaps there's no other issue on which the incentives of the US and Pakistan are less aligned than the issue of Afghanistan. But ironically, that is the issue that they end up focusing on because of Pakistan's position, of course, that geostrategic position, as it were. And I think from Pakistan's side, sort of this lack of trust on with the U.S. and this kind of fear, this visceral fear of U.S. abandonment, bleeds over into its relationship with the U.S. and how Pakistan sort of behaves when it comes to Afghanistan and more broadly. So I think establishing a broader sort of base of trust will not only help both countries sort of build that base, but also then positively affect the relationship when it comes to Afghanistan. I think Pakistan, again, while there's mistrust from Pakistan's end, Pakistan wants that broader based relationship. So the resistance to it really comes from the US end. There's this sort of this feeling of being burnt in many ways by Pakistan's double game, as it were. And so there's this sense, well, we only need Pakistan for Afghanistan, so let's try to sort of have the relationship on that front. But I think what is less understood in Washington, or perhaps not fully appreciated in Washington, is the fact that building a base of trust on other issues, on cooperation on other issues, be it climate change, be it trade, be it other issues of mutual interest, will actually incentivize Pakistan to trust the US more and then help it perhaps align some incentives and not have this kind of visceral fear of US abandonment and the need to hedge its behavior.
Marvin, turning to Pakistan's relations with India, the long-running dispute over Kashmir heated up in 2019 after India revoked the region's autonomy, prompting Pakistan to downgrade diplomatic ties and suspend bilateral trade. There's been some movement on that front in recent months, and speaking earlier in June, Prime Minister Khan said that Pakistan is ready to restart talks with India if Delhi provides a roadmap towards restoring Kashmir's previous status. Do you think we're likely to see a kind of a normalization of relations anytime soon?
I don't believe we're going to see a normalization of relations. Pakistan's prime minister has a history of wanting to have a dialogue with India. He's never been resistant to that idea, and I think that's been sincere with him. But like so many of his fellow leaders in the past, there's always making it contingent upon a change in Kashmir's status. Now, that's become, as you suggest, much more difficult after 370, Articles 370 was revoked. India took a step which is going to be exceedingly difficult for it to then reverse itself. It's a basic change here in its relationship. And for a leader like Modi, who prides himself on the Hindu principles and interests, it's just inconceivable that he's going to budge on this. Now, do I think normalization might be possible? Well, my own view is that yes, but not on Kashmir. If they're going to have normalization, there is enough here in common that they could see some progress, greater trade, exchanges of people and culture, health, the water issue, and of course, the climate, which is so greatly affecting both countries. So what I'm arguing here is that if you put Kashmir at the front of the list, you're never going to get to anything else. However, if you could see progress in all other areas of the relationship, then there might be down the road here a way to find a solution on Kashmir which both sides can live with.
Muhammad Ali, Pakistan's economic ties with China have expanded significantly in recent years, especially as part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a series of infrastructure projects linked to China's broader Belt and Road Initiative. How great of a risk is over-reliance on China at this point, of Pakistan putting all of its eggs in one basket, so to speak?
Well, Alistair, Pakistan's reliance on China was born of necessity. And the idea of CPEC becoming a flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative was largely instigated by Pakistan rather than it being pushed upon Pakistan by China. And Pakistan, this was happening at a time when there wasn't a lot of international investment in Pakistan. And Pakistan is now still trying not to put all its eggs in one basket, right? There are issues around transparency, sort of the top-down manner in which CPEC is unfolding. However, Pakistan is still trying to sort of flag its geo-economic value now rather than just geostrategic value. And it's not seeing a lot of external enthusiasm, especially by the US, to offer it strategic engagement, which complements, if not supplants, that being offered by China, strategic and economic engagement. And while it might not be viable for the US to make investments in Pakistan which match those being made by China, the US can certainly do a better job in avoiding the framing of Chinese involvement in Pakistan as a zero-sum game. The prior US administration made no bones in how it was talking about debt diplomacy and predatory lending by China, and Pakistan and China was sort of pushed back against that. But also what the current administration needs to, try and find a balance on is its increasing strategic alignment with India, right? And realizing that that does incur an opportunity cost, especially when this alignment can be used by India to not only push back against China, but also to assert hegemony over Pakistan. So increased in US intelligence sharing, data sharing with India post-Himalayan skirmishes with China has evoked serious concern in Pakistan. These are the pressures that compel Pakistan to tighten its embrace with China. And while Pakistan playing sort of the role of a Cold War mediator to enable a US-China rapprochement may not be relevant in the current geostrategic context, Pakistan can still become, in a limited sense, a testing ground for US-Chinese cooperation on issues like climate change, promoting regional connectivity in South Asia, and even averting the threat of an escalating arms race in the region with a tit for tat, with Pakistan looking at India and India looking at China and China looking at the US. And, that can add to the friction within South Asia.
But yeah, building on that, how can Islamabad maintain a balance between its relationships with Beijing and Washington, especially as US-China competition heats up?
Sure. I mean, I think that Islamabad's relationship with China is both a challenge for its relationship with the US, but also offers it opportunities. And so Muhammad Ali mentioned zero sum. Pakistan has repeatedly said that the US should not view Pakistan's relationship with China and Pakistan's relationship with the US as a zero-sum competition. That is to say, Pakistan is saying, look, we are open for business to the US as well, and our relationship with China does not preclude us having a great economic relationship with you. And in fact, leading up to President Biden's inauguration, Pakistan was really setting out its geo-economic pitch and saying, come invest in Pakistan to the US, and saying, we're open for business. Now, President Biden's administration really has not sort of taken this up, again, as was mentioned earlier, because it's sort of really focused on the relationship with Afghanistan, but also because Pakistan's sort of economic potential, it requires more than Islamabad's rhetoric to be something that is attractive, right? Pakistan actually needs to show its economic attractiveness to the US. So that's sort of one side. For Pakistan to say that the US should not view it as zero sum is somewhat disingenuous, because Pakistan eventually does have to make a choice. The competition between China and the US is clear, and that's going to be a particular part of this administration. So it is inevitable that Islamabad will have to make choices at certain points. But as I said earlier, I think there's also an opportunity here. The fact that Pakistan has this relationship with China means that it has a sort of this sort of great power to rely on, and it sort of lends us this sense of security and perhaps a little bit of attractiveness vis-a-vis the U.S. as well, because the U.S. wants to make sure that it doesn't lose Pakistan, as important as it is geostrategically, completely to China. So there is that sense of, Pakistan having this relationship with China also means that it puts a bit more stress on the US to, in fact, try to, further develop its relationship with Pakistan. So I think there are sort of both ends to it. But, Pakistan's relationship with the US will be sort of limited in its prism as long as Pakistan has this relationship, as it calls it, of unwavering loyalty. And some of the phrases used are higher than the highest mountain. The friendship between Pakistan and China goes higher than the highest mountain and deeper than the deepest valley, and so on. So the US will certainly be careful with that.
Marvin, finally, I wanted to touch on Pakistan's long-standing relationship with Saudi Arabia, which has gone through a rocky patch in recent years. Resetting relations with Riyadh has been a priority for the Pakistani government, with Prime Minister Khan traveling to the kingdom in May. Where do things stand on that front now, and do you think we'll see ties with Saudi Arabia return to their previous closeness?
We have to understand that Saudi Arabia and Pakistan need one another. So there's always going to be a relationship which is pretty close. At the same time, there's undoubtedly been a drift of Pakistan's interests more broadly. There have been some issues between them, particularly, of course, the emergence of China in the fashion that it has given Pakistan an alternative to Saudi Arabia to some extent. And we've seen examples of that when Mohammed bin Salman reneged on a offer that he had made, and the Chinese stepped right in and made up for it. But my point really is that their relationship is important to both of them, and that we're unlikely to see that relationship sour very much more than it has. It won't be what it has been in the past, but it's a essential part of both countries' security policies as well as other aspects of their foreign policy.
We've covered a lot of ground in our conversation today, but before we wrap up, I'd like to get each of your thoughts briefly on what you see as the biggest foreign policy challenges facing Pakistan today. Let's start with you, Mohammad Ali, and then Madiha, and then close with you, Marvin.
So for me, Alistair, it's a bit of an amalgam, but I do feel that, for Pakistan, given the kind of narrative that it's set for itself, Kashmir, it might not have to precede everything else, but it has to be approached simultaneously. And the problem is that Article 370, with India having revoked the special status of Kashmir and assumed brought that territory into its folds, creates a big challenge, right? Because it's a contested territory. And the days of revisionism are long gone. And even the Musharraf government post 9/11 and around that time had come up with a formula that was quite Kashmir-centric, right? And there's a possibility that Kashmir on Indian side could stay there and Pakistani side could stay here, and you sort of soften the line of control, which seemed to have been the best formula put forth, to date. And the challenge is how to sort of rethink that in light of the fact that India has revoked Kashmir's special status, because that is going to remain a thorn in the side of the bilateral relationship, while this larger great game rivalry and climate change issues necessitate cooperation and sort of, regional engagement, Kashmir is going to remain a problem, and how do they solve it? The other problem is this balance that I've already alluded to, trying to find some balance between the great game between China and the US and where Pakistan can fit in without having to join either camp. And lastly, in Afghanistan, I think one of the great opportunities which is perhaps being missed, is the possibility of long-term economic engagement with Afghanistan, and doing so in a way that also serves Pakistani economic interest as well. And there was talk of a reconstruction opportunity zone, right? I mean, the US has arrangements like this in place in Egypt and Israel, right? And this is something that could have created an opportunity zone where both countries have an incentive to work together and providing them preferential access to US markets. I mean, this is an idea that's not new. It's been debated in the Congress, and it went up to the Senate and then kind of dissipated. And now there's talk again of reviving it. But the US and Afghanistan, and the Pakistan and Afghanistan also need to be talking about this stuff, right? Like, rather than just focusing on counterterrorism and US-led imperatives, this is a time for them, particularly for Pakistan, to sort of, to bargain and to think of long-term possibilities for engagement which are mutually beneficial. And I think that would be a major foreign policy win if, on the sidelines of, thinking long-term stabilization, something like an ROZ can also be put in place.
So to me, the biggest foreign policy challenge facing Pakistan is something that it has set out for itself. And that's a sort of a redefinition, if you will, of itself on the world stage. Pakistan, in particular, over the last 20 years, has really been defined by its relationship, of course, with Afghanistan, by its relationship with terrorism. And it's been a negative sort of definition of the country. And I think the challenge that it has put out for itself, and this has been something that the Chief of Army Staff has articulated, this has been something that the civilian government has articulated, is to come out of that kind of negative prism and redefine it. And the geoeconomic framework is that kind of desire to redefine itself. And it's not the recognition that Pakistan's rise in the world would be predicated on economic concerns while sort of taking advantage of its geostrategic location is not an unwarranted recognition, right? This is potentially something that can work. However, Pakistan has to put in the work for this. Other countries, basically just sort of foisting that geoeconomic framework on the US and asking it to accept it is not going to work. And in recent weeks and months, as we've seen the US not be responsive to the geoeconomic framework, we've already seen Pakistan not talking about it very much. It already seems to have sort of taken a back seat. But I think if it really is serious about that redefinition, how does it manage its relationship with Afghanistan, manage its relationship with the United States, such that it's not through an Afghanistan lens alone, but that it also is playing a positive role in Afghanistan and not seen as playing a negative role in Afghanistan, yet is redefining things to be beyond that Afghanistan lens alone. I think that is going to be its biggest challenge. And I think the particular sort of environment of today, which is that Pakistan is actually still in the middle of a pandemic. It's the third wave is now subsiding in Pakistan, but it's going to take longer to come out of this pandemic because of the fact that, vaccines have not been taken up by more than 2% of the population. So the pandemic is going to be a reality for Pakistan for the time being. How does it become a country that is economically attractive to the US when it is in fact dealing with economic troubles and sort of the persisting pandemic, I think is the challenge. And I don't necessarily see this as a short-term challenge. I think this is certainly a medium to perhaps even a longer-term challenge for Pakistan. But if it delivers on this, if it actually, sort of is able to deliver on this geoeconomic potential pitch, I think that could eventually, perhaps be a game changer for it. It's a tall order, but that would be an ambitious foreign policy challenge.
Marvin, how about you?
Well, I can sum it up pretty quickly. Afghanistan, Afghanistan, Afghanistan. As I see it, this problem of Afghanistan, and particularly what happens over the next few months and perhaps few years, is going to determine so much about Pakistan's foreign policy options. Its relationship with the United States, particularly really on as an issue at the moment. Its relationship with all of its neighbors is wrapped up in what happens in Afghanistan. So as we single out one variable which we have very little understanding about what's going to happen, this is the one in which I come down most strongly on.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but Marvin, Madiha, Muhammad Ali, thank you all for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.